In the final months of 1944, on a nameless Pacific island freshly torn from Japanese control, 17 women stood in a line outside a half-collapsed military barracks. Their hands trembled, their eyes fixed on the dirt beneath their feet. They had been told nothing, but they understood everything. Execution squads didn't need to announce themselves. The air itself carried the weight of finality, thick with humidity and the distant sound of waves crashing against coral reefs that had witnessed so much death already. Kazue Mihara, 23 years old, a military nurse who had spent the last 2 years tending to dying soldiers in field hospitals across the Pacific, pressed her palm against the rough wooden wall behind her. The wood was splintered, scarred by shrapnel, still warm from the tropical sun that had risen just an hour earlier. She thought of her mother's face, the way it looked in the morning light filtering through paper screens in their home in Kyoto. She thought of cherry blossoms, how they fell like snow in spring, how her father used to say that beauty and death were inseparable. She thought of how strange it was that her last memory of home would be the smell of disinfectant and blood, the screams of soldiers calling for mothers who would never hear them, the feeling of life slipping away beneath her hands no matter how hard she tried to hold it in place. The American soldiers who discovered them 3 days earlier had seemed just as shocked as the women themselves. Kazue remembered the moment the basement door opened, the sudden explosion of light that felt like violence after 10 days of absolute darkness. They had been locked down there by retreating Japanese forces, abandoned like equipment that had outlived its usefulness. The commander had said nothing when he ordered them into the basement. His face had been blank, empty of everything except exhaustion and something that might have been shame. The door closed. The lock clicked. And then there was nothing but darkness and the sound of 17 women breathing, trying not to panic, trying not to think about what it meant to be left behind. 10 days, 240 hours, 14,400 minutes. Kazue had counted them all. They had no food after the 3rd day. Water ran out on the 5th. By the 7th day, some of the younger women had stopped speaking entirely, retreating into themselves, their eyes vacant even in the darkness. Chio Kurosawa, the oldest among them at 26, had moved through the basement like a ghost, touching shoulders, whispering reassurances that none of them believed but all of them needed. She told them stories about her childhood in Hiroshima, about the river that ran through the city, about summer festivals and paper lanterns floating on water. She told them about her grandmother, who had lived to be 97, and claimed the secret to longevity was stubbornness. She told them that they would survive because they had to, because their stories weren't finished yet, because the universe didn't bring people this far just to let them die in a basement on an island whose name they didn't even know. When the door finally opened, when the light poured in like liquid fire, Kazue had been certain it was the end. She had heard stories about what happened to prisoners, especially women. She had heard whispers in field hospitals. Rumors passed between soldiers who thought the nurses weren't listening. She knew what men did in war when they stopped seeing other humans as human. So when the American soldiers appeared, silhouetted against the blinding tropical sun, she had pressed herself against the wall and waited for the inevitable. But the inevitable didn't come. Instead, there was shouting in English, harsh and incomprehensible. Then there was movement. Soldiers entering the basement carefully, their weapons raised but not firing. One of them gagged at the smell, the accumulated stench of 17 women trapped without sanitation for 10 days. Another one swore, a long string of words that Kazue didn't understand but whose tone was unmistakable. Disgust, yes, but also something else. Horror, maybe. Recognition that what they were seeing was wrong in a way that transcended language and nationality and war. The soldiers had brought water. Kazue remembered the canteen pressed into her hands, the way her fingers couldn't quite grip it properly, the way the first sip burned her throat because she had forgotten what swallowing felt like. She remembered being led out of the basement, stumbling on legs that had forgotten how to support weight, shielding her eyes against the sun that felt like it was burning holes through her skull. She remembered seeing the other women, really seeing them for the first time in 10 days and being shocked at how they looked. Skeletal, filthy, broken. She wondered if she looked the same. She knew she did. They were taken to a makeshift holding area, a cleared space near what had once been a Japanese command post. There were other prisoners there, men mostly, soldiers who had been captured during the island's fall. They stared at the women with expressions Kazue couldn't read. Shame, perhaps, or anger, or nothing at all. Just the blank exhaustion of people who had survived something unsurvivable and didn't know what to do with the fact of their continued existence. For 3 days they waited. They were given food, rice and canned vegetables that tasted like metal, but filled the screaming emptiness in their stomachs. They were given blankets, rough wool that scratched but provided warmth against the surprisingly cold nights. They were given silence, no explanations, no information about what would happen next. And in that silence, the rumors began. The male prisoners whispered about executions. They said the Americans were just waiting for orders. That high command was deciding what to do with Japanese POWs, now that the war was clearly ending. Some said they would all be sent to camps in Australia, brutal places where prisoners died of disease and neglect. Others said they would be used as forced labor, sent to rebuild the cities that Japan had destroyed. A few, the ones whose eyes had gone distant and empty, said it would be simpler than that. A line, a wall, rifles, done. Kazue tried not to listen. She tried to focus on the practical things, on cleaning herself as best she could with the limited water they were given, on checking the other women for injuries and infections, on maintaining some semblance of the medical discipline that had kept her sane through 2 years of war. But the whispers crept in anyway, settling into her mind like smoke, impossible to keep out no matter how tightly she closed her mental doors. On the morning of the 4th day, they were told to line up outside the barracks. No explanation, just an order, delivered by a young American soldier who wouldn't meet their eyes. Kazue's heart had stopped. This was it. This was the moment. She looked at Chio, who stood beside her, and saw her own terror reflected back. Chio reached out and took her hand, squeezed it once, hard enough to hurt. It was the last bit of human comfort Kazue expected to feel. The American captain approached. He was tall, taller than any Japanese man Kazue had ever seen, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His uniform was clean but worn, marked with the kind of use that spoke of long campaigns and longer nights. His eyes were blue, a color Kazue had only seen a handful of times in her life, and they moved across the line of women with an expression she couldn't interpret. Not hatred, not desire. Something else. Something almost clinical. He stopped in front of each woman, studying her face for a long moment before moving on. When he reached Kazue, she forced herself to look up, to meet his eyes, to face her death with whatever dignity she could muster. He said something in English. The words meant nothing to her. He frowned, repeated himself, louder this time, each syllable pronounced with exaggerated care. Still nothing. His jaw tightened. He moved on. The inspection, if that's what it was, took nearly 30 minutes. 30 minutes of standing in the sun, muscles locked, breath shallow, waiting for the sound of rifles being raised. But it never came. Instead, the captain finished his walk down the line, spoke briefly to another soldier, and then left. Just left. Walked away as if they were nothing more than equipment he had been asked to inventory. The relief that flooded through Kazue was so intense it felt like drowning in reverse, like being pulled up from deep water into air that was too thin to breathe. Her legs gave out. She sat down hard in the dirt, not caring about dignity anymore, just grateful to still be alive. Around her, other women were doing the same, some crying, some laughing in a way that sounded more like screaming, some just sitting in stunned silence. But the relief was temporary. It always was. Over the following days and weeks, as they were processed and transferred, first to a larger holding camp on a different island, then to a military hospital in Guam, the specter of execution never fully disappeared. It hung over them like a second sky, dark and heavy and ready to fall at any moment. Every time guards came to wake them, Kazue braced herself. Every time they were told to line up, she wondered if this was finally it. Every night, lying on a narrow cot in a barracks that smelled of disinfectant and fear, she wondered if she would see another sunrise. The psychological torture of not knowing was, in some ways, worse than a bullet. A bullet was quick. A bullet was final. This endless uncertainty, this constant state of bracing for death that never quite came, was its own form of execution, just slower, more cruel, more thorough in its destruction of anything resembling hope. The military hospital in Guam was where everything changed. though Kazue didn't realize it at first. The hospital was a sprawling complex of prefabricated buildings and converted warehouses, filled with the wounded from across the Pacific Theater, American soldiers recovering from injuries, Allied prisoners liberated from Japanese camps, and, in a separate wing heavily guarded and isolated from the rest, Japanese POWs. Captain Ellsworth Brennan was the chief medical officer for the POW wing. Kazue learned his name weeks after arriving, overhearing it in conversations between guards. He was the same man who had inspected them on that terrible morning, the one with the stone face and blue eyes. Here, in the hospital, she saw a different side of him. He moved through the wards with purposeful efficiency, examining patients with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size, issuing orders in a voice that expected to be obeyed but never shouted. He was a surgeon, she learned, trained at some prestigious American medical school whose name meant nothing to her, a man who had spent the last 3 years putting broken soldiers back together with whatever tools and supplies he could scrounge. The decision to use Japanese women POWs as medical assistants was controversial. Kazue heard the arguments through the thin walls of the barracks where they were housed. Some officers thought it was dangerous, that the women might sabotage treatment or gather intelligence. Others thought it was practical, that trained nurses were in short supply and it made sense to use available resources regardless of nationality. Brennan had apparently been the deciding voice, arguing that the women were medical professionals who had taken the same oaths he had, that their skills were needed, and that keeping them locked in barracks doing nothing was a waste. So Kazue and 5 other women, the ones who had verifiable nursing experience, were put to work. They were given clean uniforms, American military issue modified to fit their smaller frames. They were given supplies, real medical supplies, not the improvised substitutes they had been working with for the last 2 years of the war. They were given patients, Japanese soldiers who had been captured in various operations across the Pacific, men who looked at them with expressions ranging from gratitude to shame to blank incomprehension. The work was familiar and foreign at the same time. Familiar because wounds were wounds, infections were infections, broken bones needed to be set, and bleeding needed to be stopped regardless of whose body they were attached to. Foreign because the environment was so different from the field hospitals she had known. Here, there were proper operating rooms with electric lights and sterilization equipment. Here, there were antibiotics, real antibiotics, not just prayers and hope. Here, there was a sense that saving lives was the priority, not just a desperate attempt to slow the inevitable tide of death. But there were other things too, disturbing things that Kazue noticed as the weeks passed. Many of the male POWs had injuries that had clearly never been properly treated, shattered bones that had been set incorrectly, leaving limbs twisted and useless, infections that had festered for months, turning minor wounds into life-threatening conditions, burns that had been left to scar without any attempt at skin grafts or proper care. It was as if these men had been injured and then simply abandoned, left to heal or die on their own with minimal medical intervention. And there was something else, something that Captain Brennan began to notice with growing alarm. A significant number of the POWs didn't respond to verbal commands. At first, the Japanese officers among the prisoners, men who had been captured along with their units and still maintained their rank structure even in captivity, dismissed these men as defiant or insubordinate. They mocked them, called them cowards who were pretending not to hear in order to avoid work details. Some even struck them, sharp blows to the head that made Kazue flinch and look away. But Brennan saw something different. He noticed that these men flinched at loud noises, their bodies reacting to vibrations and sudden movements, but they didn't turn their heads toward voices. He noticed that they stared blankly when spoken to directly, not with the sullen defiance of someone refusing to cooperate, but with the confused frustration of someone who genuinely couldn't understand what was being asked of them. He began testing them, simple hearing tests that required no language, just responses to sounds at different volumes and frequencies. The results were damning. These men weren't defiant. They were deaf partially or completely, their hearing destroyed by artillery fire, explosions, untreated ear infections, or simple prolonged exposure to the constant noise of war. Kazue watched him work through this realization. She saw the moment it clicked for him, the way his expression shifted from confusion to anger to something that looked almost like grief. He began documenting everything, taking detailed notes on each case, measuring hearing loss, tracking which injuries had caused it, building a comprehensive picture of systematic medical neglect. One case in particular seemed to affect him deeply. A young soldier, no older than 19, who had been punished repeatedly for failing to obey orders. His back was covered in scars from beatings. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, marked by the kind of terror that comes from being hurt over and over without understanding why. Brennan examined him carefully, testing his hearing, his vision, his reflexes. The boy was almost completely deaf, his eardrums ruptured by an explosion that had occurred months earlier during a battle whose name he couldn't remember. He had been trying to follow orders. He simply couldn't hear them. Brennan had turned to the Japanese officer who had been supervising the boy's punishment, a lieutenant whose uniform was still crisp despite months in captivity, whose posture still radiated the rigid authority of the Imperial Army. Brennan said something in English, his voice low and controlled but vibrating with fury. Maz Okada, the Japanese-American soldier who served as translator, had gone pale. He translated haltingly, softening the words but unable to completely hide their venom. The lieutenant's face went red. He began to shout back, defending himself, defending the Army's discipline, defending a system that treated physical disability as moral failure. Brennan had cut him off with a gesture, sharp and final. He ordered the boy transferred to a different ward, away from the other Japanese POWs, away from the officers who had tormented him. He arranged for special accommodations, visual signals instead of verbal commands, written instructions, patience. The boy had cried when he realized he wasn't going to be punished anymore, silent tears running down his face as he bowed over and over, trying to express gratitude for something that should have been basic human decency. That night, Brennan asked Maz to bring Kazue to his office. She went, terrified, certain this was some kind of trap or prelude to interrogation or worse. The office was small, cramped, filled with medical texts and stacks of paperwork that threatened to avalanche off every surface. Brennan sat behind a desk that looked too small for him, his large frame hunched over a notebook filled with handwriting so precise it looked like printing. He asked her about the Japanese Military Medical Corps. His questions were specific, detailed, the kind that came from someone who had been thinking about this for a long time. What training did nurses receive? What protocols existed for treating injured soldiers? What happened to men who couldn't return to combat? What was the attitude toward physical disability, toward mental trauma, toward any kind of weakness that made a soldier less than fully functional? Kazue answered carefully, honestly. She told him about the culture of absolute obedience that permeated every level of the Imperial Army, about how soldiers were taught that their lives belonged to the Emperor, and that survival without victory was shameful. She told him about the limited medical resources, yes, but also about the deliberate choices that were made about who received treatment and who didn't. She told him about the rigid hierarchy that left no room for compassion, about officers who saw wounded men as burdens rather than human beings, about a system that valued death in battle over survival with injury. She told him about things she had seen in field hospitals that still haunted her dreams. Soldiers with treatable wounds who were given minimal care because resources were being saved for men who could return to combat. Men with severe injuries who were given morphine and left in corners to die quietly because surgery would take too long and use too many supplies. Soldiers who begged for help and were told that their duty was to endure, to suffer in silence, to prove their loyalty through pain. She told him about the deaf soldier she had treated in a field hospital in the Philippines, a young man whose hearing had been destroyed by an artillery barrage. He had been terrified, unable to understand why people were angry with him, why he was being punished for something he couldn't control. She had tried to advocate for him, tried to explain to the commanding officer that he wasn't disobedient, he was injured. The officer had looked at her like she was insane. Deafness wasn't an injury, he said. It was a failure of spirit. The soldier was transferred the next day. She never found out what happened to him, but she could guess. Brennan listened without interrupting, his pen moving across the notebook in quick, precise strokes. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight, and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in English, soft and serious. Maz translated, "Thank you." That was all. Just thank you. But the way Brennan said it, the weight he put behind those two simple words, made it clear that he meant something more. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for being a witness. It was the first time an American had treated her like a person rather than an enemy. The first time someone had asked for her knowledge, her experience, her humanity, and actually listened to the answer. Kazue left that office feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was more than just a body waiting to be disposed of. The months that followed developed a strange rhythm. Kazue worked in the hospital, tending to patients who were nominally her enemies but who looked at her with the same exhausted gratitude that all wounded people showed to those who eased their pain. She learned bits of English, picking up medical terminology and simple phrases through constant exposure. She watched Brennan work, watched him fight with supply officers for better equipment, watched him argue with military administrators about treatment protocols, watched him spend his limited free time documenting the systematic medical neglect he was uncovering. She also watched the war grind toward its conclusion. News filtered into the hospital in fragments, whispered conversations between guards, newspapers that were days or weeks old by the time anyone saw them, the changing mood of the American personnel that shifted from grim determination to cautious optimism to something that might have been relief. And then, in August 1945, it ended. Not gradually, not with a whimper, but with two explosions that rewrote the rules of war and made everything that had come before feel almost quaint in comparison. Kazue heard about Hiroshima first, then Nagasaki, then surrender. The words meant nothing at first, just sounds without context. But then she saw Chio's face, saw the way all color drained from it, saw the way her hands started to shake and wouldn't stop. Chio was from Hiroshima. Her family was in Hiroshima, had been in Hiroshima, past tense. Probably. The Japanese POWs reacted in different ways. Some refused to believe it, insisted it was American propaganda, that Japan would never surrender, that the emperor would fight until every last citizen was dead. Others seemed almost relieved, like a terrible weight had been lifted, like they could finally stop pretending that death was preferable to survival. A few became completely catatonic, retreating so far into themselves that no amount of medical intervention could bring them back. Kazue felt numb. The war was over. Japan had lost. She should feel something about that. Grief or anger or shame or relief, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. Just the exhausted understanding that she had survived something that should have killed her and now had to figure out what surviving actually meant. The American celebrations were distant, muted by the walls and wire that still separated POWs from the rest of the hospital. Kazue could hear music, laughter, the sound of people who believed that the worst was finally over. She wondered if they were right. She wondered if the worst was ever really over, or if it just changed shape and kept going. For Kazue and the other women, the end of the war brought not relief, but a new terror. What happened to Japanese POWs now? Repatriation was the official policy, sending prisoners back to Japan to face whatever remained of their homeland. But repatriation meant returning to a country that had been devastated, its cities burned, its people starving, its entire social structure shattered. It meant facing families who might reject them for the shame of capture, for the dishonor of survival. It meant returning to a society that had no place for women like them, women who had seen too much, done too much, survived too much. Kazue tried to imagine it. Getting off a ship in Japan, walking through streets she wouldn't recognize, trying to find a home that might not exist anymore, trying to explain to her father, if he was even alive, where she had been and what she had done, trying to rebuild a life in a country that had been rebuilt on top of ashes and bones and defeat. The image wouldn't come into focus. Every time she tried to picture it, her mind slid away, unable or unwilling to confront that particular future. But staying meant what exactly? America was the enemy. America had dropped those bombs. America had won. What place could she possibly have here? The answer came in late September, delivered in Captain Brennan's cramped office with Mazokata translating and a tired-looking woman from the Red Cross taking notes. Some Japanese POWs, Brennan explained, particularly those who had provided valuable assistance to American forces, were being offered the option to remain in the United States under supervised status. It wasn't citizenship, it wasn't freedom, but it was a choice. The program was small, experimental, controversial. It applied primarily to POWs who had worked as translators or provided intelligence that had saved American lives. But Brennan had argued, successfully it seemed, that medical personnel should also be eligible. He had documented everything, all the hours Kazue and the other women had worked, all the lives they had helped save, all the ways they had contributed to the hospital's mission. He had built a case for them brick by brick, page by page, fighting bureaucracy with the same determination he fought disease. Kazue looked at Maz, searching his face for guidance. He was Japanese, or at least Japanese-American, caught between two worlds in ways she was only beginning to understand. He had fought for America against Japan. He had translated orders that led to Japanese deaths. He lived with contradictions that would have broken most people. If anyone understood the impossible choice she was facing, it was him. He said nothing, but his slight nod told her everything. This was a chance, maybe the only one she would get. Take it or spend the rest of her life wondering what if. She accepted. So did two other women. The rest chose repatriation, preferring the known horrors of post-war Japan to the unknown future of staying in America. Kazue understood. She might have made the same choice if she had anything to return to. But her mother was dead. Her father had disowned her, if he was even alive. Her brother had made it clear she wasn't welcome. She had nothing to go back to except ghosts and shame. The process took months. Paperwork, interviews, medical examinations, background checks. Kazue was questioned repeatedly about her political beliefs, her loyalty, her reasons for wanting to stay. She answered the same questions over and over, trying to find the right words to explain something she barely understood herself. She didn't love America. She didn't hate Japan. She just wanted to live, and living seemed more possible here than there. In early 1946, she was released from POW status and transferred to a church-sponsored resettlement program in Oregon. The program helped former POWs, primarily Japanese but also some Germans and Italians, integrate into American society. It provided temporary housing, job placement assistance, English language classes, and a network of sponsors who were supposed to help with the transition. Kazue was given a new name, Catherine Mihara. The first name was chosen by a well-meaning social worker who thought it sounded friendly and American. The last name stayed the same, though Americans pronounced it wrong, swallowing the syllables and turning it into something that didn't quite sound like her family name but was close enough. She practiced introducing herself. "Hello, I'm Catherine." "Hi, I'm Catherine. My name is Catherine." The words felt strange in her mouth, like wearing someone else's clothes. She was given a job at a textile factory, working long shifts operating machinery that turned raw cotton into fabric. The work was repetitive, mindless, hard on the hands and back, but easy on the mind. She could lose herself in the rhythm of it, the mechanical precision that required no thought, no decisions, no confrontation with the past or future. Just the present moment, the whir of machines, the smell of cotton and oil, the ache in her shoulders that meant she was still alive and capable of feeling pain. She was given a room in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson, a thin woman in her 60s who asked no questions and expected no explanations. The room was small, barely large enough for a bed and a dresser, with a single window that looked out onto a street lined with identical houses. It was clean. It was safe. It was hers. After years of sleeping in barracks and hospitals and basements, having a door she could close and a space that belonged to her felt like unimaginable luxury. She was given a second chance at life, but it came with the condition of silence. The program coordinators were explicit about this. Don't talk about the war. Don't talk about being a POW. Don't talk about Japan or the military or anything that might make people uncomfortable. You're starting over. Act like it. Be American. Smile. Assimilate. Disappear into the fabric of this country until no one can tell you we're ever anything else. So Kazue, now Catherine, learned to be silent. She never spoke about the war. She never spoke about the basement, the lineup, the mornings she thought would be her last. She never spoke about the soldiers she had tried to save, the ones who died holding her hand, the ones who thanked her with their last breaths for giving them the dignity of not dying alone. She never spoke about Captain Brennan or Mazukata or Chio Kurosawa, or any of the people who had shaped her survival. She packed all of it away in a corner of her mind and tried to forget it was there. She learned English slowly, painfully, through a combination of classes and immersion and sheer stubborn determination. She learned to navigate American social customs, the strange rituals of small talk and casual friendships, the way people said, "How are you?" without actually wanting an answer. She learned to smile at neighbors who sometimes looked at her with suspicion, sometimes with pity, sometimes with curiosity. They were too polite to voice. She learned to celebrate American holidays, to cook American food, to live an American life that never quite fit but was close enough to pass. She sent letters to Japan, trying to reconnect with her family, trying to find out who had survived and who hadn't. The responses were few and cold. Her mother had died during the firebombing of Tokyo, burned alive or crushed under rubble. No one was sure which. Her father had survived but disowned her, writing a single brief letter that made it clear she was no longer his daughter, that her survival and her choice to stay in America were unforgivable betrayals. Her younger brother wrote once, a few stilted paragraphs that conveyed more obligation than affection, to tell her she was no longer welcome in the family. After that, she stopped writing. There was no point in reaching out to people who had already decided she was dead. In 1952, she met Hiroshi Tanaka at a community event organized by the resettlement program. He was 10 years older, a Japanese immigrant who had come to America before the war and spent years in an internment camp, first at Manzanar and then at Tule Lake. He had lost everything: his business, his savings, his faith in the country he had tried so hard to become part of. He was bitter, broken in ways that matched her own brokenness, and maybe that's why they fit together. Not love exactly, not passion, just mutual understanding. Two people who had survived the unsurvivable and recognized that survival in each other. They married quietly in a civil ceremony with no family present because neither of them had family anymore. They rented a small house on the edge of town, a modest place with peeling paint and a yard that refused to grow anything except weeds. They built a careful life together, one built on routine and silence and the unspoken agreement not to ask too many questions about the past. Hiroshi worked as a gardener. Catherine continued at the textile factory. They existed side by side, companions in survival, if not in joy. They had no children. Whether that was by choice or circumstance, Catherine never said. Maybe she didn't think she had the right to bring new life into a world that had shown her so much death. Maybe she was afraid of what she might pass on, what trauma might be coded into her DNA and inherited by someone who didn't deserve it. Or maybe it just never happened, and they accepted that as one more loss in a life defined by loss. Hiroshi died in 1968 of a heart attack, sudden and massive, the kind that killed before the ambulance could arrive. Catherine found him in the garden, collapsed among the roses he had been pruning, his face peaceful in a way it never was in life. She arranged the funeral, a small service attended by a handful of people from the Japanese-American community, and some of Hiroshi's gardening clients who felt obligated to pay respects. She buried him, went home, and continued living, because that's what survivors did. They continued. She kept working at the factory until her hands could no longer manage the machinery, arthritis turning her fingers into claws that refused to cooperate. She retired at 65 with a small pension that was barely enough to cover rent and food. She spent her days in the small apartment she had moved to after selling the house, watching television she didn't fully understand, reading newspapers in English that still felt like a foreign language even after 30 years. She became invisible, one more elderly woman living alone, unremarkable and unremarked upon. She died in 1979, alone in that small apartment, of pneumonia that started as a cold and progressed faster than anyone expected. A neighbor found her 3 days later when mail started piling up. She was 58 years old, which felt both too young and too old, a life cut short and stretched out at the same time. The funeral was attended by 3 people: the neighbor who found her, a former co-worker from the factory who barely remembered her, and a pastor from a church she had attended sporadically over the years. None of them knew her story. None of them knew who she had been before she was Catherine Mihara. She was buried in Riverside Cemetery, a sprawling municipal graveyard on the outskirts of town, in a plot purchased by the county because she had no family to make arrangements. The headstone was simple, standard issue for indigent burials. Catherine Mihara, 1921-1979. Just a name and dates. Nothing else. No beloved wife or mother. No mention of her service as a nurse. No indication that she had survived a war, Survived capture, survived execution, survived 35 years of living with survival. Just a name that wasn't really her name, and dates that marked the boundaries of a life that had contained so much more than those numbers could ever convey. But someone noticed. Vivian Brennan, daughter of the late Captain Ellsworth Brennan, had been going through her father's effects after his death in 1978. He had died of cancer, slow and painful, the kind that gave him time to put his affairs in order and say goodbye to everyone he needed to say goodbye to. Among his possessions, Vivian found journals, dozens of them, leather-bound notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting that documented his entire military career. Most of it was medical notes, case studies, treatment protocols, the kind of professional documentation any doctor might keep. But scattered throughout were personal observations, reflections on the things he had seen and done, the ethical dilemmas he had faced, the ways war had changed him. And in the journals from his time in Guam, there were extensive entries about the POW hospital, about the Japanese prisoners he had treated, about the systematic medical neglect he had uncovered, about his growing understanding that the enemy was more complicated than propaganda had led him to believe. He had written about the women POWs, about the decision to use them as medical assistants, about the controversy that had caused. He had written about Kazue Mihara specifically, about her skill as a nurse, about the conversations they had through Masokata's translation, about how she had helped him understand the brutal culture that had shaped the soldiers he was treating. He had written about advocating for her to stay in America, about pulling strings and filling out paperwork and arguing with bureaucrats who thought letting Japanese POWs remain in the country was insane. He had written about wondering what happened to her after she left the hospital, about hoping she had found some measure of peace, about carrying a low-grade guilt that he hadn't done more to help. Vivian read those journals multiple times, absorbing her father's words, trying to understand the man behind them. She had known he served in the Pacific, known he had been a military doctor, but he had never talked about it in detail. Like so many veterans, he had packed those memories away and tried to move on. But the journals revealed someone different from the quiet small-town doctor she had grown up with. They revealed someone who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and still fought to preserve what was best in it. She became obsessed with finding out what had happened to the people her father had written about. She started with Masokata, who turned out to be relatively easy to locate. He had gone on to a long career in the State Department, working as a translator and cultural liaison during the post-war reconstruction of Japan. He was retired now, living in California, and when Vivian called him, he remembered Captain Brennan immediately. They talked for hours, Maz sharing memories that complemented and expanded on what was in the journals. He remembered Kazue too. He remembered helping her fill out the paperwork to stay in America, remembered the fear in her eyes when she made that choice, remembered wondering if he had done the right thing by encouraging her. He knew she had been sent to Oregon through the resettlement program, but after that he had lost track of her. He had always meant to follow up to check on how she was doing, but life got busy and years passed and eventually it seemed too late. He gave Vivian what information he had, names of program coordinators and locations, fragments that might lead somewhere or might lead nowhere. Vivian spent months following those fragments. She contacted veterans organizations, church groups that had sponsored resettlement programs, local historical societies in Oregon. She visited libraries, pored over immigration records, made phone call after phone call. Most leads went nowhere. Records had been lost or destroyed. People had moved or died. The bureaucracy of the immediate post-war period had been chaotic, and documentation was spotty at best. But she kept looking, driven by something she couldn't quite name, a sense of obligation to her father maybe, or a growing conviction that these stories mattered, that the people who had slipped through history's cracks deserved to be remembered. She started visiting cemeteries in towns where Japanese immigrants had settled after the war, walking through rows of headstones, looking for names that might be familiar. In the summer of 1979, she found it, Riverside Cemetery, a plot in the section reserved for indigent burials, a simple headstone with a name that matched. Catherine Mihara, 1921-1979. The dates were right. The location was right. The name, anglicized but recognizable, was right. Vivian stood there for a long time, staring at the headstone, thinking about her father's journals, about the woman who had survived execution only to die forgotten, about all the ways history failed to remember the people who deserved remembering most. She took photographs. She made rubbings of the headstone. She contacted the cemetery office and obtained what records they had, which wasn't much: death certificate, burial permit, a notation that the deceased had no known next of kin. She contacted the county coroner, the apartment building where Catherine had lived, the factory where she had worked. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece together the outlines of a life. She contacted local newspapers, pitching the story of a Japanese POW nurse who had survived the war and lived quietly in their community for decades. Most weren't interested. Human interest stories about dead Japanese women didn't sell papers. But one editor, a young woman who had studied history in college and understood the value of primary sources, agreed to run a small piece. It appeared on page 7, 3 paragraphs and a photograph of the headstone, easily overlooked and quickly forgotten. But someone saw it. A researcher at the National Archives who was cataloging wartime POW records. A historian writing a book about Japanese-American experiences during World War II. A member of the Japanese-American Citizens League who had been working to document the stories of Issei and Nisei who had been affected by the war. The story began to spread, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. More researchers got involved. More records were uncovered. The full story of what had happened on that Pacific island in 1944, the 17 women who had been locked in a basement and then lined up for what they believed was execution, began to emerge from fragmentary documents and fading memories. Some of the other women were tracked down, those who had survived and were willing to talk. Their testimonies added depth and detail, confirming and expanding on what was already known. Chio Kurosawa had been repatriated to Japan in 1946. Records showed she had returned to Hiroshima, or what was left of it, searching for family members who had all perished in the bombing. She had died by suicide in 1947, unable to live with the weight of survival when everyone she loved was gone. Her death certificate listed no next of kin, no one to claim her body, no one to remember her except as a statistic in the long list of post-war casualties. Maz Okada, when interviewed by researchers, spoke openly about his experiences for the first time in decades. He talked about the impossible position of being Japanese American during the war, about fighting for a country that had imprisoned his family, about translating orders that led to the deaths of people who looked like him. He talked about the POW hospital, about Captain Brennan's determination to treat every patient with dignity regardless of nationality, about the women who had worked alongside them. He talked about Kazue, about how she had impressed everyone with her skill and professionalism, about how he had hoped she would find happiness in America. Learning that she had died alone and forgotten broke something in him. He wept during the interview, an old man crying for choices made decades ago, for roads not taken, for all the ways good intentions failed to prevent tragedy. Captain Ellsworth Brennan's journals were donated to the National Archives, where they became part of the permanent collection documenting medical practices during World War II. Researchers pored over them, using his detailed observations to better understand the treatment of POWs, the ethical challenges faced by military medical personnel, the ways war forced impossible choices on people who were just trying to do their jobs. His daughter Vivian became something of an expert on the subject, giving talks at universities and historical societies, making sure her father's work and the people he had written about weren't forgotten. The story of Kazue Mihara, the nurse who survived execution in 1944 and whose name appeared on a gravestone 35 years later, became a small footnote in the larger history of World War II. Her story was included in books about POWs, about women in war, about the Japanese-American experience, about survival and memory and the cost of silence. A historical marker was eventually placed near her grave, a small plaque that provided context for anyone who cared to read it. But most people didn't. Most people walked past that grave without noticing, without wondering who Catherine Mihara had been or what she had survived. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the real lesson of her story isn't about grand historical narratives or important lessons learned. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just about the fact that she lived, that she survived when she shouldn't have, that she carried impossible weight for 35 years and never complained, never asked for recognition, never demanded that anyone remember. Maybe it's about the thousands of people like her, people whose names appear on gravestones with no context, People who lived through history and then disappeared into it. People who deserve to be remembered not because their stories are exceptional, but because they're human. This is the story of Kazue Mihara, who stood in a line in 1944 expecting to die and lived another 35 years instead. It's a story about survival, about the cost of living when you were supposed to die, about the silence that follows trauma, about the people who slip through history's cracks, and the few who bother to remember them. It's built on documented facts, on military records, on journals and letters and gravestones, on the testimony of people who were there, and the research of people who came later. It's true, as much as any story about the past can be true, assembled from fragments and gaps in the unreliable memories of people trying to make sense of things that don't make sense. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. History belongs to all of us, but only if we choose to remember it. And remembering means more than just knowing dates and names. It means understanding that behind every statistic, every casualty count, every line on a map, there were real people who lived and died and survived and carried their survival like a weight that never got lighter. People like Kazue Mihara, whose name appeared on a gravestone 35 years after she braced for execution, whose story almost disappeared completely, whose life mattered even though history almost forgot to notice.